Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Decarbonization of Industry, Mapping Progress on the Lux Carbon Canvas. So decarbonizing, hard to decarbonize industries is a big topic we hear a lot about from clients, and I'm really excited to be sharing a webinar on this with some really interesting analysis from our presenters. My name is Mike Holman. I'm SVP and Group Director here at Lux, moderating today. And our actual presenters will be Anthony Schiavo, who's a Senior Director and Principal Analyst, and Abhirab Basu, who's an analyst here at Lux. So during the webinar, you can type any questions you have into the questions box on your screen. We will have some time for questions at the end and get to as many of those as we can. But if your question doesn't get answered or you think up another great one afterwards, don't hesitate to email questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will get back to you. So with that, I will step out of the way and let us get into the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Anthony Schiavo, and I'm delighted here to be presenting Decarbonization of Industry, Mapping Progress on the Lux Carbon Canvas. And I'm joined by my colleague, Abhirab. Abhirab, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Anthony. Good to be here.
Yeah, it is good to be here because we have a really important topic to talk about. I think everyone understands that decarbonization is increasingly becoming a top priority for government. You have the European Commission, the Biden administration, governments all over the world making industrial planning a core part of their policy. And we also have industry seeming upping its commitment. You've got startups and major players committing to hydrogen and novel technologies. Boston's own Sublime Systems is a good example. They recently raised $40 million to decarbonize cement. So in this presentation, we're going to be focusing a little bit, not on industry generally, but on three particular sectors: steel, aluminum, and cement. Abhirab, why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a little simple answer, I'd say. Industrial sector broadly is about a quarter of the global emissions and about 40% of all the energy use. So that's a big focus for governments around the world to decarbonize by 2030 and beyond. Together, just these three sectors, the steel, cement, aluminum, make up about 60% of those emissions within this industrial segment. Now, over the last decade, we've seen a pretty big uptake in emissions. More recently, you've seen a lot of gas to coal switching as well in countries. But there's also been slightly slower industrial output. But overall, I'd say the direct emissions, which is what we look at as Scope 1 emissions, are pretty huge in these three segments in the steel, aluminum, and cement space. Unlike, say, something like chemicals and pulp and paper, which we've also done quite a bit of work in, these three sectors, their Scope 1 emissions are a big chunk of their emissions portfolio. And part of the reason of that is that heat plays a really big role in the way these sectors produce their products, right? So they need fuel like oil, natural gas, and coal. They burn that for processes for the blast furnace, for steel making, for clinker production, for cement, for smelting in alumina. And so that's why their Scope 1 emissions are pretty high. And these are also very tough to abate segments because of the heat demand. So I'd say that's one of the biggest reasons why we're looking at steel, cement, and aluminum.
Another important reason is that consumers are beginning to develop an awareness of decarbonization and these decarbonized products. We don't have time to get fully into it today, but this is our Lux Maturity Curve. And it tells us a little bit about the sort of consistency or the level of consensus, agreement in consumers' minds about a specific concept or idea or topic. And what you can see is that green cement, green steel, and especially green aluminum are in this early consensus zone. And green aluminum in particular is going to move into this zone of innovation probably in the next maybe 2 years to 3 years. And green steel and green cement are not super far behind. This is the zone, the level of consensus in which there's enough people who have a shared understanding of a topic that you can really begin to launch products and support commercial development. So consumers have a much more clear idea of what these things are, what decarbonization is, and increasingly, I think, a desire for decarbonized products. So we've seen governments, industry, consumers are all beginning to align around the idea that industrial decarbonization is an important priority. But how can we measure the progress that we're making? Well, at Lux, we've been using what we call the Carbon Canvas for some time. This is a tool that measures resilience to carbon pricing, as well as the ability to decarbonize. There's two key metrics that are measured on this carbon canvas. On the y-axis, this vertical axis here, we have the available capital from sales. And on the horizontal axis, we have the critical carbon price. So I'm going to go over each one of those in just a little bit more detail. The critical carbon price, we start by first looking at this gross profit minus 10% margin on sales. And very simply, we believe that a company needs to maintain a 10% margin on sales to be successful. So we take that out of the gross profit. And then we divide that by the scope 1, only scope 1, carbon emissions. And this essentially gives us the critical carbon price, a carbon price at which a company will fall below that 10% margin on sales figure and will, in our view, cease to be functioning properly. Then you also have the available capital from sales. We're going to take that same gross profit minus 10% margin on sales, and then we're going to divide that by the total revenue of the company. And this is going to give us an available capital figure as a percentage. And this does two things. One, it asks the question, how much could a company spend at a theoretical maximum on decarbonization? Basically, if they spent any more than this as a percentage, they would impact that 10% margin on sales. It also normalizes the comparisons because we want to be able to compare different sized companies here. So if we reported this available capital just as an absolute figure, some companies would look like they had a lot more resources, and that isn't necessarily the case. Coming back to the carbon canvas, we then set two sort of levels or benchmarks. The first is a USD $200 per ton carbon price. This, we think, is the theoretical maximum for carbon prices. We really don't expect to see a carbon price above $200 per ton, even in the sort of medium to long term. So if you're above this figure, you're not really at risk for carbon pricing. And then secondly is a 20% available capital from sales. We think this is an important benchmark as a measure of flexibility. If you're above this, you have a lot of optionality in terms of your existing assets. You can invest in them, you can divest from them. But if you're below this, you're really locked into your existing asset base. You don't necessarily have the cash, the resources to really begin to separate out or move away from that existing asset base. So with all that, let's take a look at the carbon canvas for companies in the steel, cement, and aluminum space. Abrab, what jumps out at you or is sort of most impactful here? Oh, these are the companies, and I have to mention, we do have an honorable mention, Nucor. They are all the way out to the right at about $1,200 critical carbon price. And we have a dishonorable mention, Chalco, or Aluminum Corporation of China Limited. They're basically right down there at 0.0. And again, this is mostly 2022 with some 2021 data, and it's scope 1 data. So with that, I'll ask Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, so what we've done here is put companies from the cement, steel, and aluminum space, representative companies from there, on this carbon canvas. And you can see right off the bat, right, like majority of companies have a really low or have a low critical carbon price. So that's a critical carbon price that's lower than $200 per ton. And so that's, you can see the companies on the left-hand side of the $200 minimum. And so that's not a great thing. A lot of these companies are at a risk of a carbon price catastrophically impacting their profitability. So That makes it really difficult for a lot of these companies to continue emitting CO2 at the current rate if, say, a potential carbon price of $200 was to be implemented. Now, the other thing I want to say is that you can see that there's quite a few companies sort of distributed above and below that 20% margin that we've kept on the financial or the available capital from sales that these companies have. But I really want you to focus on that lower left-hand quadrant, right? There's quite a few companies that have a critical carbon price that's lower than $200, and they don't have enough available capital from sales to, invest in decarbonization. So they lack the money to buy, say, carbon offsets, invest in carbon reduction technologies, or are basically kind of locked into their carbon intensive assets. So these group of companies are intensely vulnerable and they're likely to miss their decarbonization targets by 2025 and 2030. The other thing I do want to highlight is how these carbon prices or how these companies compete within sectors and across each other. And so to look at that, we look at the average carbon price, right? So an average carbon price for all these companies is about $200 per metric ton, which is right at the boundary that we set it. But that doesn't really tell you much of a story. The average carbon price is actually higher because you've got folks like Nucor who have a really high critical carbon price. So I think it's the median over there that gives you, paints the real picture. The median carbon price, or critical carbon price, is of $96. And to give you an idea, when we did this analysis for other sectors like the oil and gas, chemicals, fertilizers, they show up pretty poorly as compared to oil and gas, chemicals, and fertilizers. So at $96, they're about half of the critical carbon price of those industries, which means, again, they're pretty vulnerable to a carbon price. Now, we've seen the 2023 graphic. It's not a very pretty picture. I do want to show you how that compares to this exercise that we did back in 2019. So in 2019, we looked at, again, companies across steel, cement, aluminum, and how they performed. And right off the bat, again, you'll see there are a few companies, yes, that are locked into that lower left-hand side quadrant, but there are a lot more companies that are doing slightly better financially. So in comparison to 2023, in 2019, a lot more companies had the financial ability to invest in decarbonization. So in 2023, companies don't have the financial power, and they've not really made a lot of change to their critical carbon price. And all that points to the fact that there's not really been much of any meaningful progress that's been made on decarbonization. One of the things that really highlights this is very recently the CEO of Rio Tinto announced they're going to miss their 2025 decarbonization goals unless they're able to purchase credits, right? So this is a company which has a pretty reasonable critical carbon price. They have the cash on hand, but they've just not been able to advance their carbon abatement projects as fast enough. So Rio Tinto has the cash to invest in purchasing credits, and not a lot of other companies have that ability. So that really shows that not a lot of progress has been made, and a lot of companies are going to be vulnerable as they try to meet their 2030 goals. Now, I do want to look a little closer into different industries. So we're going to first take a look at the cement space. And cement paints a pretty interesting picture. If you compare 2019 and 2023 data, a lot of cement companies have actually tumbled down in their financial position. A few companies like Ambuja and Heidelberg, they still have access to capital, particularly Ambuja. They do well in their domestic market. That's 20% margins after taxes. So they're pretty healthy over there to invest in carbon reduction technologies. But I want to look at more at their Chinese counterparts. So companies like Anhui Conch, Taiwan Cement, that have faced a few challenging years, high energy prices, lower demand in their domestic market from the real estate space. That's kind of really curtailed their ability to basically make more money. And that's led to a lower demand of cement. So that kind of shows how a future or a carbon price that if that gets levied onto the cement industry makes these companies really vulnerable. Now, I do want to not be all gloomy and show a few of positive examples as well. Heidelberg's an interesting case over there. We've seen revenues grow for Heidelberg over the last 3 years by about 5% or so. They're lowering their net emissions by 2% of CO2, and their aim is to lower their Scope 1 emissions by about 28% by 2030. And to do that, what Heidelberg's done is focus pretty aggressively on carbon capture utilization projects. So they've got 9 projects that's there in their portfolio. In 2022, they launched one in the US, which is about 2 million tons of carbon per year. They also have one of the largest CCU plants in a cement plant in Norway. They're working with Aker Solutions on that. But on whole, they're looking at abating about 8 to 10 million tons of carbon per year. And so what Heidelberg's done is they've seen that there's an opportunity here. They have reasonable capital on hand. And what they want to do is by 2030, get 50% of their revenues from these low carbon products. And to do that, they've invested heavily on CCU. So they're looking at not only capturing the carbon, but also utilizing that to lower their overall carbon intensity of their cement. So I think, it's interesting that that they've gone in quite heavily on CCU, and you're going to see a lot of companies try to do that. CCU is not a bad strategy for several companies, particularly as these are, again, as I mentioned, really hard to decarbonize industries. Electrifying a kiln is going to take quite a bit of while. The technology is not ready yet or not there yet. So CCU is a good strategy. A lot of other companies are also looking at things like recycling cement, and doing things like this mineralization of cement that can help lower their carbon intensity. But yeah, I think this is an interesting case. Heidelberg seeing the opportunity, they're investing in CCU. It's a capital intensive aspect of CCU, but which not everybody can afford. But I think you're going to see companies like this focus on developing their low carbon business in the future.
Let's turn now to the aluminum companies, because I think it's kind of a very interesting group of players. If you look at the overall emissions, if you remember back, aluminum is a relatively smaller segment compared to steel, cement, and chemicals. But actually, the sector is still very vulnerable to carbon pricing. And that's just because those materials are very, very intensive in terms of their overall carbon footprint. I mean, you're looking at just naturally from the reactions, from the level of energy intensity, at least 6x, more emissions, and in some cases it's higher. There are paths to decarbonize. You look at a company like Norsk Hydro, and you can see that there are clearly paths out there. And from a technological standpoint, I think the aluminum sector is, in some ways, a lot easier or a lot more straightforward than something like steel. But ultimately, it's still in a very challenging position, even leading companies. And again, I wanted to call out some of these players in China because I think that's such an important story. And if you look at China Hongzhou Group, they're a really interesting situation. They're one of the largest aluminum companies in the world. They face a double challenge. So if you look at their critical carbon price, just focusing on Scope 1, it's around $50. Scope 1 and 2 together, it's around $33. So basically, a third, an additional third, or cutting that critical carbon price, down by a third, which is really significant. I mean, $33 is not a very hard carbon price at all. In addition, this company is primarily a domestic producer of aluminum. They primarily sell to other Chinese companies. For international sales, you have a lot of concerns about things like the CBAM, the European, carbon border adjustment mechanism. But a lot of that aluminum is going into the building sector, which obviously doesn't leave China, but plenty of it's going into things like EVs and other export products. So these emissions are ultimately making their way out into the global market, and they're ultimately going to be faced, I think, with an increasingly more strict global regulatory scheme. And we also probably are going to see more domestic regulation from the Chinese government as that 2060 net zero goal does creep closer. So a company like this is facing significant challenges, both with Scope 1, but also with the broader context of its upstream emissions in terms of electricity and the global regulatory context.
Yeah, I think we can move on to the steel companies. The steel sector is pretty interesting. You know, we've seen it change a little bit since 2019. You know, again, a lot of companies don't have that financial firepower. They're struggling a little financially. But we've also seen some positive cases. We've seen companies that have been able to hop out of that lower quadrant. You know, in the 2019 data, ThyssenKrupp and Nucor were both in the lower quadrants. And I'll get to why Nucor is doing so much better than the others. But ThyssenKrupp also makes a pretty interesting example. You know, steel industry is, again, very tough to decarbonize, a lot of Scope 1 emissions, not a lot of big opportunities to cut emissions in the short term, given the kind of technologies that are being used. But what ThyssenKrupp has done is they've had their steel business where they're, you know, investing in things like CCS and hydrogen for direct reduced iron, but they've also tried to build out a low carbon or invest in a low carbon or a green business, and that's through their green hydrogen arm called Nucera, which builds electrolyzers, producing hydrogen for industrial companies. Now, so what it does is by having this kind of combination of strategies where they are trying to generate revenues from a low carbon business, that allows them the flexibility to operate their steel business while kind of gradually decarbonizing that really heavy industry that they're in, right? So I think ThyssenKrupp is a good example of how you can sort of leapfrog out of that really dangerous zone in the lower left-hand quadrant. The other example I do want to point out is Nucor. Now, Nucor has a different strategy altogether. The company is one of the largest steel producers in North America. And they've been growing pretty aggressively. They've been bringing in cash as they saw there's an industry upturn in prices for steel between 2019 and 2022. Their revenues dramatically went up from 20 billion to about 40 billion. They've been able to tap into other new markets through acquisitions. And so they've tried to go further downstream into their product segment to find that additional customer base for their steelmaking segment. So they've acquired companies in the utilities, telecom, transportation sector that service those markets. So again, they've looked at acquisitions as a way to grow, but they've also focused on directly cutting their emissions. So they've invested in CCS. They've used the financial power that they've grown over the last few years to invest in DRI plants, but also they're a very recycling-centric focus, right? So Scope 1 emissions for Nucor are low. They're almost at no risk from emissions pricing at about $1,200 of critical carbon price. And the reason they've been able to keep their carbon intensity low for their steel production is recycled steel or scrap makes up about 70% of their steel products, 75% of their steel products. And recycled scrap requires about 1/8 of the energy to produce steel, whereas as compared to iron ore. So, you know, recycling has played a big part in their strategy to help decarbonize. Now, the challenge is everybody can't be a recycler. So you're going to have to look at certain other opportunities. There's pretty high rates of recycling, but it still gives you a good idea of how companies are trying to jump out of that kind of locked into their carbon assets and then get out of that segment. And, you know, I think one of the things that I already highlighted is that opportunities for decarbonization in the near term, you know, things like energy efficiency improvements, increasing scrap recycling rates, right? Like Nucor is doing. But this segment's steel in particular is going to have to wait for some kind of a breakthrough solution like electrifying their furnaces that really cut down the emissions, because they all their processes use so much heat. So I think what we've seen here is there are some near-term opportunities, but in the long term, they're going to actually pay out by some really technological breakthroughs.
As we look at this overall carbon canvas, I'd emphasize two things. One is that there's a really pivotal set of years ahead of the industrial sector. We've really got to see substantive progress get made on industrial decarbonization, both from the perspective of climate change as well as from the perspective of we do have a lot of these industrial policies in place now that should be supporting this transition. So it's really the time. And the second thing I would emphasize is we've been talking a lot about carbon prices. And that's because in 2018, 2017, when we made the carbon canvas, that was really the main tool. But a lot of the industrial policy has similar impacts to carbon pricing, just by a different name. So a good example of this would be the credits for hydrogen production or credits for carbon capture in the U.S. under the Inflation Reduction Act. These have the same effect as a carbon tax in terms of making certain technologies competitive against the conventional approaches. Now, they don't have the same sort of revenue generating effect for the government. They don't have the same profitability damaging effect for the companies, but the introduction of those incentives globally is a big part of the reason why you do see companies, being able to invest in things like CCUS. So if you're just looking at this and saying, well, carbon taxes haven't really happened yet, that's true in some geographies, but it's I would say, a limited view. And there is a lot of policy changing that is enabling certain companies to outcompete their competitors. So the risks are very real and they're very current and present. With that, I think we'll just leave you the last few takeaways. One, a lot of industrials haven't made much progress on decarbonization since 2019, 2020. Two, companies are really going to have to scramble to cut emissions amid the sort of rising pressure. And they're going to have to do it cost effectively because not a lot of them have the financial firepower needed to make it work. And three, there are a lot of risks, geopolitical risks, energy risks, inflation risks that could derail these efforts. We've seen that go in positive ways for someone like Nucor, who's benefited a lot from rising steel prices, but also we've seen it go a lot of negative ways in Europe, during the energy crisis. So there's a lot of risks here, and that's why companies need to be proactive and they need to have balanced strategies. Rob, any final thoughts?
I think you summarized it pretty well. I think structural change has been slow. Overall emissions are ticking up. A lot of companies are at risk. We've highlighted that. These companies are facing quite a bit of headwinds, right? High interest rates, inflationary markets, high cost of capital. That's really slowing down progress. But you're also seeing companies that are trying to find the way out of that. So it's going to be really interesting to see when we do this exercise again in a year or two, how these heavy emitting industries, are they really making good on their decarbonization goals? And if they're not, what does that fallout mean?
Well, with that, we want to thank you for your time and your attention. We're now going to open it up for questions. I just encourage you to come to our upcoming webinars on carbon removal and the net zero oil and gas company, because I think both of those are pretty closely linked in here. Mike, what kind of questions?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Abhirab, Anthony. We do have time for questions now. Again, type any of those into the questions box on the screen, and even if we don't get to all of them here, we will follow up with you on anything that you leave us there. I guess one thing that's coming up here that I think is kind of pivots off that last point is you guys have painted kind of a grim picture of the challenges for this industry in the face of carbon prices. Doesn't this just mean that all the production is going to shift to less regulated countries, so they're going to be less subject to carbon pricing?
Well, I think we've seen, and I kind of touched on this, we've seen a lot of policy be formulated as more carrots than sticks, right? And that will have a long-term impact on competition. That will have a long-term impact on, what technologies are cost competitive. So the transition is definitely going to take place. but the carrots are going to encourage people to keep that technology at home. And then you also have things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, tariffs in general, trade tensions between China and the rest of the world. Especially in this context, China is such a dominant producer of a lot of these materials. So I think it's a bit more complex than that. And I think that there's a competing set of incentives and penalties, that are going to make this a bit more of a challenging landscape than simply just, we're going to move it to a low production area. Plus, there's questions of natural resources, right? You need natural gas, you need coal, you need iron ore. It's not trivial to move this kind of production.
So you touched a little bit on scope 2 and 3, but maybe this is a better way to put it. Like, what is this question here is, what does this mean for downstream companies, right? The firms that are buying and using probably especially steel and aluminum, but also concrete and their products or projects. Given that there seems to be a little bit of a limited opportunity for these companies to invest in fundamentally changing their process, right? If they're just all going out there and buying credits like Rio Tinto is, are customers just going to end up paying more for these materials due to the carbon price, or what does it mean for the downstream customer?
Well, Abra, I'm curious for your thoughts, but I think the companies like Heidelberg who can decarbonize with some sort of, regulatory support will be able to be very competitive because they'll offer these lower carbon products at a reduced cost compared to, maybe not compared to conventional material, but compared to other decarbonized materials. But Abra, I'm curious for your thoughts here.
Yeah, the Heidelberg example is a good one, right, for companies that are trying to build that business in the future. It might be their customers might pay a little bit of a premium initially, but I think in the long term, the company like Heidelberg is really going to benefit from investing in that CCUS and then kind of feeding that into their products and coming out as a potential winner in that space. In the steel example, I think there's also some. The new core is the interesting one. We're seeing how they're vertically integrating, right, to produce their steel products while they're simultaneously lowering their own scope 1. And so in the long term, again, that's going to mean that the overall footprint of those products that then go downstream are going to be lower. So I think those two make a good case for companies that are trying to decarbonize their operations while producing products that have a lower footprint in the long term.
So, time for maybe one more question. So we got time for maybe one more question here. So it may be particularly relevant to the companies that do have some cash on hand to invest. How do you think about them finding the right balance between divesting carbon-intensive assets? Are we going to see some of these companies that potentially get broken up into the, less intensive downstream businesses like you referred to, ThyssenKrupp's electrolyzers, and the, on the one hand versus the still very emissions-intensive kind of core materials business on the other? How do you see that playing out, and how do you see companies managing that to avoid the risk of falling into that lower left quadrant?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I like Anthony's view from the chemical side because we see some few chemicals company breaking up and with the commodity chemicals versus the specialty, say low carbon chemicals business as well. But yeah, I think the ThyssenKrupp example is interesting. You're seeing how some of these companies are trying to diversify. Be the solution provider as well for those industries, and even when you look at the graph, the industrial carbon canvas, you can see that ThyssenKrupp's actually right on the border of kind of falling back into that thing. So they have to be figured out pretty carefully on what that strategy is. And so building that low carbon business it makes sense. because that gives them a little bit of that financial power while they're able to gradually decarbonize their assets. So it's going to be a little bit of walking a tightrope scenario. But we've seen this on the chemical side as well. So Anthony, why don't you give us some insights on that?
I think there's a little bit less pressure here to split up the business, because in chemicals, you already had companies moving towards pharmaceuticals and ingredients, these naturally high value, low emissions businesses. Whereas here, some companies like Nucor are moving more downstream, but a lot of companies are not, especially in like the cement space. It doesn't make a ton of sense. So I think you are going to see more companies stay together, although the companies who can will probably try and execute a strategy of splitting the business. I just think it's going to be less possible across the space.
Well, yeah, as you guys said, interesting days ahead in the next few years here for companies in this industry, and I'm sure we'll be continuing to follow it here. But that will be all we have time for on the webinar today. We will send out the slide presentation and recording for all the attendees by email. If after you leave the webinar, you will get a prompt to fill in a survey on the presentation today. We really appreciate if you could take just a minute or two to do that. We look very closely at that feedback and use that to help inform and improve our future webinars. And as Anthony said, check out some of the upcoming webinars. And thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.